It's really kind of a wacky time to be a Warhammer fan. On the one hand, more people than ever know and care about your hobby, which is great. On the other hand, in some ways, your hobby is in the worst condition that it's ever been. Take, for example, the, at the time of writing, recent drama about the addition of female custodies to the lore. Personally, I don't really care. I know there's been a long-standing desire to put them into the lore, and that doesn't really affect me in any way. People have been customizing their mini armies since this hobby was invented. Just because somebody wants to field female custodies doesn't mean that anybody is being forced to, right? We can imagine a world where things would be flipped, and the addition of male custodies might have caused a fuss. The reality there, just like the reality now, is that people have always chosen to customize their models to suit their own desires because that's what the collecting part of this hobby has always been about. That's why people do it. The actual crime, the one that caused proportionately much less fuss, was the idea that the Custodes Codex dropped and that it was incredibly poorly received. Army size creep and lackluster, weaker rules means that Custodes players have to pay more to field worse troops. Seems like Games Workshop makes constant missteps, generating massive amounts of outrage, some legitimate and some not. So, let's talk about a case where I think Games Workshop objectively made some lore a lot more inclusive, and of course it didn't cause a fuss. So, Warhammer 40k is probably the most popular Games Workshop product by a country mile. Despite the popularity of this product, I would say that far more people engage with 40k the media franchise than they do 40k the tabletop game. After all, it's very easy to watch YouTube videos, like for example, the ones made by my lovely co-host Callum, but it's easier to watch YouTube videos than it is to buy, paint, and then play with tabletop minis. Personally, I think I've fallen a bit out of favor with 40k. I've played the game before, I've played it for many years, but I think my real love of Warhammer comes from its now recently revived older brother, Warhammer Fantasy. It's not that I don't like sci-fi, I probably like sci-fi more than I like fantasy as a genre, but Warhammer 40k is really too blended to be true sci-fi, and the hopeless nature of the setting is something that I can only engage with for brief periods of time before I just have to take a break. Warhammer Fantasy is definitely not bright and sunny, but it's positively cheery by comparison. Despite all the numerous and terrible wars, life in Warhammer Fantasy continues to exist and in some cases thrive. It feels like people can come together and face adversity, and although it will cost them, they can sometimes triumph. They're not fighting to preserve crumbling, decrepit systems, they're, in some cases, legitimately fighting for a better tomorrow. Despite all of this, it's not to say that the setting is without some issues. In particular, I think the role of women in this setting is something that has been a source of contention. To give the setting its credit, women are definitely not categorically excluded from it. I can think of more than a few women as characters inside of the setting. Most of the Warhammer fantasy books that you will end up reading from Black Library will definitely include women in them, and a few even have women as much more prominent characters. But in terms of the way these women are represented, they traditionally fall basically into the roles of spies, or seductive vampires, or spellcasters or something. There are only a handful of examples of prominent women in the setting who break this archetype, such as Valkia the Bloody, who is, of course, a demonic servant of the Blood-Gored Corn, and, of course, talked about on this channel previously, Repanse de Leonesse, who is Bretonia's version of Joan of Arc. I can think of a few reasons for why this might be. I think it's obvious that Warhammer Fantasy is inspired by history, or in some cases just wholesale ripped off from it, and traditionally, in historical warfare, men are the ones who have done the majority of the fighting. So it would make some sense that the human-centric factions like Bretonia, Empire, Warriors of Chaos, for example, might follow those patriarchal norms. It follows then that, of course, women are traditionally excluded from most of the representation because in our own world, women have traditionally been excluded from fighting. Despite the majority of warriors being men, of course, women were still involved in military systems. They would often be in the army's baggage train. They would serve as camp followers and assistants. Many soldiers would travel with their wives, so women would not necessarily be so unfamiliar to the military system as one might imagine. Not to mention that we always have documented cases of women pretending to be men to serve in the military in disguise. What I'm getting at is that our own real-world history need not be a stranglehold on the fictional history of a place that doesn't exist. Warhammer Fantasy is inspired by history, but it's not actually history. Magic, the undead, orcs and goblins, none of this is actually real. and yet people are conditioned to accept this as perfectly normal, whereas women have to carve out niches for themselves in specific ways to even be represented. A great example, of course, as a longtime Empire player, is the case of Countess Emanuel von Leibowitz, Elector Countess of Nuln. She is the only female Elector Count that's mentioned in the lore. In the previous Warhammer Fantasy canon, she was the one major exception to the general rule that Elector Counts were men. And of course, she's also not a fighter. She exists purely within a very narrowly defined band for what a woman is allowed to be. The other counts, all being men, are all described as warriors who sometimes personally take to the field. In fact, many of them prefer to take to the field rather than actually governing. They're also the only ones who had models that you could use in-game, go figure. But, as you know, Warhammer Fantasy no longer exists, and instead we have Warhammer the Old World, which is a return to the setting of Warhammer Fantasy, but a few hundred years in the past. In some cases, it might be considered a sort of soft reboot, or perhaps maybe an alternative continuity, although of course Games Workshop has still confirmed that the End Times is canon. In a lot of ways, I think Old World is an ideal sort of game for me. It's not meant to be played overly competitively. You get more out of it by working with your opponent to tell narratively flavorful stories instead of hyper-fixating on scoring points. It's got wacky and flavorful rules, like the return of my beloved pigeon bomb table. I would always take pigeon bombs on my engineers, and they never did anything. I think in my entire history of playing Warhammer Fantasy, I don't think I ever actually killed anyone with a pigeon bomb, but I love rolling on the table, so you gotta take pigeon bombs. But, of course, Old World has also made a couple of subtle changes to the lore that I find really interesting. For starters, they included female heads for the use of Bretonnian foot knights. Unlike in 40k, where female custodies caused a massive amount of drama, I don't think the idea of female Bretonnian knights caused as much of a fuss. Certainly, I don't remember there being a flood of hate videos on the internet about it. Some people might have complained, but I think that hate train quickly lost steam. Because again, I don't think anybody is forcing anyone to do anything that you don't want to. You don't have to have women in your Bretonnian army if you don't want to, but you can't really stop anybody else from making their army how they see fit, right? A point that I feel like I have to state here is that men do not have a monopoly on heroic fantasy. Right? I'll say that again. Men do not have a monopoly on heroic fantasy. We are not the only people capable of harboring power fantasies about fighting a dragon. Women have them too. They've just been conditioned not to think of themselves that way. Which of course brings me to the thing that actually inspired this video. I was looking over some scenarios in the rulebook for running games of Old World. I highly recommend these as they bring me back to the days when Games Workshop would provide pretty detailed stories for how to get your game set out. I was reading the rules and I found a couple of interesting mentions. Firstly, something that jumps out is, of course, a female Elector Countess fighting against a rival Bretonnian lord. But unlike Emanuel von Leibowitz, this woman fights her own battles. Of course, she dies in the course of them, but, nobles, regardless of gender, have a short life expectancy in wargames. Another one is a very casual mention of an imperial captain who just happens to be a woman. The Empire is obviously inspired by the Holy Roman Empire, but they don't have any rules that saying women can't serve in the imperial army. It's just that we never got any real representation of women before that. It was just sort of assumed that all of the soldiers would be men. These lore descriptions are very subtle. On a first reading, you probably might even just miss them. But I think they're a great addition to the lore. With just a few lines, we establish that the world of Warhammer Fantasy is actually a lot more inclusive than it might have been presented in other ways. And I think it's a really simple way to do that as well. Just a few lines of text. And Old World establishes that this is the kind of space for anybody looking to diversify their armies in ways that weren't explicit before. You don't have to do it, but you can, right? It's all about possibilities. It's all about expanding the possibility space of what Warhammer could be for many different people. I highly doubt that this is really going to change the way that people play Warhammer, of course, but I do think it is good to have. Warhammer borrows from history, but that doesn't mean that history has to be a shackle on Warhammer. Nothing is fundamentally lost with these inclusions. I think it just makes the world a little bit richer in detail. Warhammer is a framework for all players to use it as we see fit. So, make your armies how you want, and if you embrace others, I think others will embrace you. Just remember to thin your paints. So, that's the video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe and share if you found it interesting. A quick note to shout out our patrons, Dorian, Liam Anderson, and Discordance. You can join our lovely patrons at the link in the description. Until next time, take care.